The female reproductive system includes several structures, including the ovaries and the uterus. The ovaries are the gonads that produce oocytes, and then hormones like estrogens and progestins. The uterine tubes extend from the uterus to the ovaries, and the uterine tubes transport the oocytes to the uterus every month. The uterus is a muscular organ where fertilized ovum implant and grow. The vagina extends from the uterus. It's a muscular passageway. It starts at the cervix of the uterus and extends to the external genitalia. The external genitalia include the labium minus or labia minora because there's two of them. These are flaps of skin that are deep to the labium majus or labia majora. And so the inner labium minus has no hair on it, no pubic hair, whereas the labium majus does contain pubic hair. The ovaries have three basic functions. They produce oocytes, those are immature gametes. They secrete female sex hormones like estrogens and progestins. And they secrete inhibin, which is a hormone that provides negative feedback, which will moderate the secretion of another hormone called FSH or follicle stimulating hormone. Normally, the uterus bends anteriorly near its base, and we call that anteflexion, but occasionally the uterus will tip backward, and then that's called retroflexion. The ovaries and the uterus are suspended in the pelvic cavity by ligaments. The broad ligament is a wide fold of peritoneum that connects the sides of the uterus to the walls and the floor of the pelvis. The ovarian ligament extends from the uterus to the ovary. The round ligament, which we can't see on this diagram, but we'll see it on another diagram later on, and it extends from the uterus to the pubic bone. And then there's the suspensory ligament, and the suspensory ligament extends from the ovary to the pelvic wall. Major blood vessels enter the ovary at the ovarian hilum. And we can see these arteries and veins running alongside that suspensory ligament. Another ligament that we can see on this picture is the utero-sacral ligament, and this is a ligament that runs from the uterus to the sacrum. Each uterine tube has an infundibulum, which is an expanded area at the distal end of the uterine tube, with fimbriae attached to them, which are finger-like projections. It also has an ampulla and an isthmus that attaches to the uterus. The cells lining the uterine tube secrete a fluid that completes the capacitation of sperm. Remember, sperm are not capacitated until they meet with the conditions of the female reproductive tract. So it is those cells lining the uterine tube that will secrete a fluid that helps to make those sperm capacitated. The uterus provides mechanical protection, nutritional support, and waste removal for a developing embryo and fetus. The uterus contains some major landmarks. There's the body of the uterus, which is the majority of the uterus. The fundus is the rounded, most superior portion of the uterus. And then at the inferior portion of the uterus is the cervix. Inside the cervix is a cervical canal. Between the uterine cavity, which is the hollow cavity inside the uterus, so from the uterine cavity to the vagina is the cervical canal. And on the uterus side of the cervical canal is the internal os of the uterus, which is the opening into the cervical canal. And at the distal end of the cervical canal is the external os of the uterus, which leads into the vaginal canal. On this picture, we can see the different ligaments. We can see the ovarian ligament and the round ligament and the broad ligament. The uterine wall consists of an inner layer that's called the endometrium. Then there's a middle muscular layer that's called the myometrium. And then there's a more superficial layer that's called the perimetrium. The perimetrium is an incomplete serous layer, so it's kind of an incomplete visceral peritoneum. The vagina is a muscular tube that extends between the uterus and the external genitalia. It's lined by a non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So you remember stratified squamous, it has many layers of squamous cells and it offers a lot of protection. A thin epithelial fold called the hymen partially blocks the entrance to the vagina until physical distortion ruptures the membrane. Tampons and intercourse can both rupture this membrane called the hymen. The external genitalia consists of the mons pubis, which is the area where pubic hair grows. It also contains the clitoris, and the clitoris is a gland that's the erectile tissue, similar to the erectile tissue in the male penis. The protective flap of skin over the clitoris is called the prepuce. And then just posterior to the clitoris is the vestibule. Flaps of skin called the labia minora and the labia majora border the vestibule. In this picture, we can see a torn hymen, and then that leads into the vaginal entrance. Between the vaginal entrance and the clitoris, we can see the urethral opening. And posterior to the vaginal opening is the anus, which is the opening into the rectum. Another reproductive organ in the female is the breast. The breast contains mammary glands. The mammary glands are organized into lobules, and in between the lobules are suspensory ligaments. And there's also adipose tissue in the breasts, which offer protection to the mammary glands. The ducts extending from the lobules of the mammary glands are called lactiferous ducts. They carry milk to the nipple. The nipple is the pointed protrusion of the breast, and surrounding the nipple is a darker colored area called the areola. Here's another diagram of the uterus in which we have a bird's eye view. And so here we have the posterior side, and then here we have the anterior side of the body. And the uterus sits a little bit closer to the anterior side of the body. We can see the round ligament, how it attaches to the uterus and then extends to the pubic bone. We can see the ovarian ligament that attaches the ovary to the uterus. And we can see the uterosacral ligament that attaches the uterus to the sacrum posteriorly. The process called oogenesis is similar to spermatogenesis. At the end of oogenesis, we produce an ovum, which is a mature oocyte. There's a couple of differences, though, between oogenesis and spermatogenesis. First of all, spermatogenesis produces 4 spermatozoa from one stem cell, from one spermatogonium, whereas oogenesis will only produce 1 oocyte or 1 ovum from a oogonium. Second of all, spermatogenesis in the male begins at puberty, whereas oogenesis begins before birth, and then it becomes suspended until puberty begins. And then third, spermatogenesis produces 20 to 100 million spermatozoa per emission, whereas oogenesis will only produce 1 secondary oocyte every month. So let's talk about oogenesis. Like I said, oogenesis begins before birth. Then it accelerates at puberty and will end at menopause. So in the beginning, we start with mitosis, and this begins before a female is born. So during gestation, when this female baby is developing in the mom's womb, the stem cell called an oogonium undergoes mitosis to produce a primary oocyte. The other daughter cell remains an oogonium. The primary oocyte is a diploid cell because it contains chromosomes from both members. It contains chromosomes from the father, which are paternal chromosomes, and from the mother, which are maternal chromosomes. There's an interphase between mitosis and meiosis 1, just like we saw in spermatogenesis, and the chromosomes are replicated. Again, this is happening while that baby girl is developing inside the mother's womb. Then the primary oocytes begin meiosis 1 between the 3rd and 7th month of gestation. Meiosis 1 stops then in prophase 1 after that crossing over occurs. So the same thing that happened in the male, where the tetrads were formed and crossing over of genetic material occurred, but then that primary oocyte halts right in prophase 1, which is prophase in meiosis 1. Then the baby is born, and the baby girl becomes a toddler, then a child, and then the child reaches puberty. At the time the girl reaches puberty, the primary oocytes complete meiosis 1. One of the daughter cells is a secondary oocyte. The other daughter cell is a first polar body. This first polar body doesn't have enough cytoplasm to become a viable ovum, which means it will never be able to be fertilized by a sperm. Every month, some of these secondary oocytes will be selected to continue developing. The secondary oocytes then are going to begin the process of meiosis 2. Meiosis 2 will proceed until it gets to metaphase 2, where those chromosomes line up in the middle of the cell. Then the secondary oocyte will halt right there in meiosis 2 during metaphase 2. It's this secondary oocyte that is halted in metaphase 2 that will be released from the ovary during ovulation. The secondary oocyte will only continue meiosis 2 if it is fertilized by a sperm. If it is fertilized by a sperm, it continues through meiosis 2, and then it will become a mature ovum. Then the chromosomes of the ovum will blend with the chromosomes of the sperm, and a new organism called a zygote is formed. So when the secondary oocyte goes through meiosis 2, only one of the daughter cells can be fertilized by the sperm. The other daughter cell from meiosis 2 of the secondary oocyte is called a second polar body. Again, it doesn't have enough cytoplasm to be viable, so it can't be fertilized. The first polar body from the primary oocyte going through meiosis 1 will also go through meiosis 2 and will end up producing 2 more second polar bodies. So at the completion of oogenesis from one oogonium, we get a secondary oocyte that can become an ovum if it's fertilized, and 3 second polar bodies. Oogenesis takes place in specialized structures in the cortex of the ovary that are called ovarian follicles. Each primary oocyte is surrounded by follicle cells. The most immature phase of the ovarian follicle's development is called the primordial follicle. The primordial follicle will develop into a primary follicle, and then into a secondary follicle, and then into a tertiary follicle. Another name for the tertiary follicle is the Graafian follicle. At the center of these follicles is the developing oocyte. The primary oocyte is in the primordial follicles, and in the primary follicles, and in the secondary follicles. The primary oocyte doesn't develop into a secondary oocyte until the tertiary follicle has developed. The cycle of this development is a monthly repeating cycle that we call the ovarian cycle. There's different phases of this ovarian cycle. The follicular phase of the ovarian cycle is the first phase. So each month, FSH, or follicle stimulating hormone, is released from the anterior pituitary, and that causes several of these primordial follicles to start developing. The primordial follicles develop into primary follicles, and then a few of the primary follicles develop into secondary follicles. The secondary follicles develop a cavity that's filled with fluid. The primordial follicles, the primary follicle, and the secondary follicles all contain a primary oocyte. Meiosis I completes at the same time that the secondary follicle becomes a tertiary follicle. So at the same time the tertiary follicle is formed, the primary oocyte completes meiosis I to become a secondary oocyte. In other words, by the time that tertiary or Graafian follicle is formed, the primary oocyte has developed into that secondary oocyte. The second phase of the ovarian cycle is called ovulation. Ovulation occurs because luteinizing hormone levels rise in the blood. So luteinizing hormone, or LH, is released from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And when the luteinizing hormone levels rise, the tertiary follicle releases the secondary oocyte into the pelvic cavity. This is called ovulation. The secondary oocyte is directed into the uterine tube then by the fimbriae of the uterine tube. Remember, the fimbriae are finger-like projections at the ends of the uterine tubes. The next phase is the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So after that secondary oocyte is released, there's still follicle cells that are part of the ovary. Those follicle cells that remain in the ovary will develop into a structure called the corpus luteum. If the secondary oocyte becomes fertilized, the corpus luteum will remain as a structure until the placenta is formed that will help to protect the developing zygote. But if fertilization does not occur, then the corpus luteum will degenerate into a structure that's called the corpus albicans. After the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary during ovulation, it will be transported through the uterine tubes to the uterus. The uterine tubes are muscular tubes that are lined by cilia. The smooth muscles of the uterine tubes will contract, causing peristaltic contractions, and the cilia will create ciliary movements, and both of those things will move the secondary oocyte toward the uterus. A few hours before ovulation occurs, there's some nerves that turn on that beating pattern of the cilia and initiate the peristalsis. Before we end this video, I want to talk to you about two other hormones. There's estrogen and progestins that are produced by the ovary. Estrogens are produced by the follicle cells and by cells in the stroma, or the body of the ovary. As the primordial follicle becomes a primary follicle and the primary follicle becomes a secondary follicle, estrogen will be released from the cells surrounding the primary oocyte and will start secreting estrogen. The bigger the follicle becomes, the more estrogens will be secreted. The level of estrogen secretion will peak around ovulation, when there is the most amount of follicle cells. After the secondary oocyte is ovulated and the tertiary follicle becomes the corpus luteum, estrogen levels decline and are still being secreted from the corpus luteum, but not as in high of concentration. However, the corpus luteum does secrete progesterones. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the uterus and we'll see that the estrogens that are being secreted from the follicle cells will start to make the endometrial lining thicker. And then the progesterone that's secreted from the corpus luteum will keep the endometrial layer thick in the event that fertilization occurs and a pregnancy ensues. The corpus luteum will stay intact if implantation of a fertilized oocyte occurs in the uterus, and if fertilization does not occur, then the corpus luteum will degenerate to a corpus albicans. When the corpus albicans is formed, which is basically a scar tissue, the levels of progesterone and estrogens will plummet as the corpus albicans will no longer be able to secrete those two hormones. So you've heard me say both progestins and progesterone. Progesterone is the main progestin that's produced. This ends video 1 on the female reproductive tract, and I will see you next time when we go over video 2.